I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
One day they are on your television screen every morning. Trusted faces delivering the news with total confidence. The next day they are...
Imagine waking up one morning, getting dressed, driving to a building you have walked into hundreds of times, sitting under those bright studio lights, looking straight into that camera, and delivering the news to millions of people who trust your face, your voice, your presence. Then imagine that the very next day, your parking pass no longer works. Your email is deactivated. Your name has been quietly scrubbed from the network's website. No farewell broadcast. No send-off. Just silence. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened to some of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism. And what came after the silence is a story that almost nobody covered, until now. Segment 1. There is something uniquely disorienting about the way television news works. For decades, these anchors are woven into the fabric of daily life. You see them during breakfast. You hear their voices when something terrible happens in the world. You recognize them the way you recognize a neighbor or relative. And then one day, without warning, they are simply not there anymore. The chair is still there. The desk is still there. Someone else is sitting in it. And the anchor who used to occupy that space has vanished so completely that it almost feels like they never existed at all. This has happened more often than most viewers realize, and the reasons behind each disappearance are as different as the people themselves. Some were pushed out quietly after internal conflicts that never made the headlines. Some were caught in controversies that exploded so fast there was no time to respond. Some made decisions that cost them everything in a single moment. And some, perhaps most painfully, did absolutely nothing wrong and still lost the careers they had spent their entire adult lives building. What unites all of them is the aftermath, because disappearing from television does not mean disappearing from life, and what these people did next reveals more about who they actually are than anything they ever said on camera. Segment 2. Let's start with someone whose exit from television was not caused by scandal, not caused by poor ratings, and not caused by any failure on her part at all. Ann Curry spent the better part of 2 decades at NBC News establishing herself as one of the most credible and emotionally intelligent journalists working in broadcast television. She covered humanitarian disasters in places most of her colleagues never went. She sat with survivors of conflict and famine and told their stories with a seriousness that felt genuinely rare in morning television. By the time she was elevated to co-host of the Today Show in 2011, she had earned it in the most straightforward sense of the word. She lasted 1 year in that seat. The circumstances of her removal were widely reported at the time and widely criticized, not because she had done anything wrong, but precisely because she had not. The internal dynamics at the network during that period placed enormous weight on certain relationships and certain opinions, and the pairing simply did not work for the people whose preferences mattered most. The goodbye she delivered on air in June of 2012 was visibly difficult for her, and viewers felt that difficulty in real time. She remained at NBC in a reduced capacity for a few more years, but the platform she had earned over 15 years was never restored. She eventually departed entirely. What followed was a career that continued in a quieter register. She worked on documentary projects that were meaningful and well received by the audiences who found them, but those audiences were smaller by several orders of magnitude than the ones she had reached every morning on the Today Show. She has spoken openly about being willing to return to morning television. The invitation has not come. Her story lingers in a particular way because the injustice of it is so legible. She was not fired for misbehaving. She was moved out of the way because someone more powerful found the arrangement inconvenient. The career she had built absorbed that consequence, and she has been navigating the aftermath ever since. Segment 3. Not every disappearance is as clean as that one. Some anchors vanish because of things they did, choices they made, moments where the gap between the person they were on camera and the person they were in private became impossible to ignore or conceal. And in those cases, the disappearance tends to be faster and more complete. Charlie Rose is one of the most striking examples of this pattern. For more than 2 decades, his late-night interview program on PBS was genuinely unlike anything else on American television. He sat across from heads of state, Nobel laureates, novelists, scientists, and artists, and he asked questions that reflected real preparation and real curiosity. He also co-anchored a major morning broadcast, which meant he occupied two very different but equally prestigious corners of the television landscape simultaneously. By 2017, he was at the height of a career that had taken 30 years to build. The Washington Post investigation that appeared in November of that year changed everything within days. Multiple women came forward with detailed accounts of inappropriate conduct that stretched back years and crossed multiple workplaces. The response from the networks and outlets he worked with was immediate and complete. His programs were canceled. His contracts were terminated. His name was removed from things it had been attached to for decades. And then he was simply gone. Reports from the months that followed described him living quietly in a house on Long Island, occupying himself with ordinary activities, largely cut off from the professional world he had inhabited for 3 decades. He made occasional attempts to maintain some kind of presence, posting interviews on a personal website, but the reach of those efforts was negligible compared to what he had commanded when the full weight of major broadcast partners stood behind him. No network has brought him back. The professional world that he was central to for so long has continued without him, and there is very little evidence that anyone inside that world is actively looking for a way to bring him back into it. Segment 4. Then there is the category of anchor who vanishes not because of a long pattern of behavior, but because of a single moment, one decision, one night, one post, one sentence that cannot be taken back once it is out in the world. These stories tend to generate the most debate because the gap between the mistake and the consequence is so stark, and because the question of whether the punishment fit the situation is one that reasonable people can genuinely disagree about. Terry Moran spent the better part of 3 decades at ABC News covering politics and national affairs. He was not a celebrity anchor in the way that some on this list were. He was a working journalist, the kind whose name you might recognize without being entirely certain where you had heard it. That kind of credibility, built slowly over many years, is actually harder to earn than the more visible kind. And he lost it in a single night in June of 2025. A post he made on social media late at night, using language his employer deemed a violation of their editorial standards, led to an immediate suspension and a firing 2 days later. He later acknowledged that he had been drinking when he posted it. But he also made clear, in the days and weeks that followed, that he did not regret the substance of what he had said. He was willing to acknowledge the circumstances under which he said it, but he was not willing to distance himself from the opinion itself. That stance was unusual, and it carried real professional consequences. A more conciliatory response might have left some doors open. The position he took closed most of them. He has since built a newsletter on Substack that has found a meaningful audience, somewhere around 100,000 subscribers as of mid-2026. That is a real number, and it represents real people who are interested in what he has to say. But it is a very different kind of platform than the one he occupied for decades at a major broadcast network, and the transition from one to the other is not something that can be fully softened by pointing to subscriber counts. Segment 5. One of the most quietly devastating stories in this entire category belongs to someone whose name most people under 30 probably do not recognize at all, which is itself part of the story. Steve Kometko was a fixture on E! News for nearly a decade in the 1990s and early 2000s. He was not just present on that channel. He was genuinely good at what he did, bringing a warmth and an authentic enthusiasm to entertainment journalism that is harder to pull off than the format might suggest. He knew the industry he was covering. He respected the people he interviewed, and the audience responded to that. His firing in 2002 came from a direction that had nothing to do with his journalism or his conduct toward anyone. He was in a tense contract renegotiation when he posted something on his personal website asking fans to write letters to the network supporting him. The network asked him whether he had used a company computer to make that post. He said no, he had. When the lie was confirmed, the network used it as grounds to let him go. That is the entirety of the original mistake. A lie about a computer. A small, stupid, panicked lie told in the middle of a difficult negotiation. What followed that lie was a decade that would be almost impossible to believe if he had not spoken about it so candidly himself. He tried to find work in television and discovered that the very identity he had built at one network made him unmarketable to competitors. He eventually left Los Angeles entirely and moved to Chicago to care for his aging parents. He took a job in retail. He began drinking heavily to manage the distance between where his life had been and where it was. He spent years in that place before getting sober around 2016. The Chicago years were formative in a way that is hard to describe without making them sound either more romantic or more miserable than they actually were. He was starting over from nothing, in a city where nobody knew him, working alongside people who had no idea he had spent a decade as one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment television. That particular kind of anonymity, the kind that comes after visibility rather than before it, is its own specific experience, and he has described it with an honesty that is genuinely rare in an industry that does not usually encourage people to talk about failure in concrete terms. Since getting sober, he has worked to rebuild something through a podcast where he interviews people connected to the entertainment world. He has been open about what the years between then and now actually looked like. The audience he has now is smaller than the one he had at E! By a significant margin. But he is still working. He is still talking. He is still here. And given what the decade after his firing actually looked like, that is not nothing. Segment 6. Sometimes the disappearance is not complete, but it is long enough and quiet enough that the eventual return feels like news in itself. Brian Williams anchored the most watched evening news broadcast in the United States for more than a decade. He was not simply competent in that role. He was genuinely gifted at it, combining the weight that the format requires with a dry, self-aware quality that made him unusually compelling for a program that tends to reward solemnity over personality. His fall in early 2015 came from the unraveling of a story he had told about himself multiple times over the years, a story about being on a military helicopter that came under fire during the Iraq invasion. Veterans who had actually been there disputed his account. The record was examined carefully and publicly, and the conclusion was that his version of events did not match what had actually happened. He acknowledged the discrepancy and retracted the story, but the damage to his credibility, which is the only currency a journalist actually has, was severe and immediate. NBC did not fire him outright. They suspended him and eventually moved him to MSNBC to complete the remaining years of his contract. He hosted a late-night program there that found a modest audience, but never regained the cultural footprint of the evening news. When his contract ended in 2021, he left the network quietly. What is interesting about his trajectory since then is that it has not been nothing. He has worked as a volunteer firefighter, which is a real commitment requiring real training in real time, not the kind of gesture people make for optics. He hosted an election night special for a major streaming platform in 2024. And in April of 2026, a significant streaming company announced a podcast project with him, which suggests that at least some corners of the media world believe his voice still carries value. His is not a story of complete disappearance. It is a story of a very long and humbling detour, and where it ends is still genuinely uncertain. Segment 7. One pattern that emerges across almost all of these stories is that the firing itself is rarely the hardest part. The hardest part is what comes immediately after. The period when the phone stops ringing, when the invitations to things you used to attend without thinking suddenly stop arriving, when the professional identity you have carried for 20 or 30 years no longer belongs to you, and you have to figure out what is actually left. Brooke Baldwin spent 13 years at CNN building a reputation as one of the network's most dependable and capable daytime anchors. In February of 2021, she appeared on air and told viewers she was leaving the network to pursue other opportunities. That framing, departure as personal choice, is so standard in the television industry that most viewers accepted it without a second thought. 3 years later, she wrote an essay for a major publication revealing that she had not chosen to leave. She had been let go following a period of conflict with a producer whose behavior she had raised concerns about internally. The concerns were not addressed in the way she had hoped, and eventually she was the one who left. The decision